Welcome to the Crimson Engine. My name is Rubidium. Today we are talking bad movies, specifically the Canon Group and the 500 plus pictures that they made in the 60s, 70s, 80s. I've been fascinated for a long time with this company. They are sort of an enigma because they were these absolutely unhinged Israelis who had success in Israel, moved to America, and started a film company, first as a distributor, then as a producer. Later on, they bought a whole chain of theaters. They basically just did it all. And they produced, like I said, hundreds and hundreds of movies, most of them terrible, and yet they made millions, tens of millions of dollars, and often outperformed the big cinema chains, the big studios. And I first came across these guys in a book on Kung Fu movies called These Fists Break Bricks. And then I found out that there was a documentary about them, their cousins, and then the cousins themselves that were still alive when the documentary was being made. So they made their own rival documentary. So you can watch both of those. Sometimes they're kind of a little bit hard to get, but they're around. There's also a pretty wild podcast called The Canon, where these two improv comedians go over dozens, maybe even hundreds of the Canon films and review them and explain the plots. Canon would be easy to dismiss if it was just a schlockfest, if it was just they just made bad movies. But sometimes, almost by mistake, they made some really good movies, and some of them were even classics, like Runaway Train, and a ton of them made a lot of money. So today I want to break down kind of my thinking about, as an independent filmmaker, what Canon represented, what they did right, what they changed, what they did wrong, because they eventually went bankrupt and kind of burnt out the industry. And how I see what Canon is doing is applicable to independent filmmaking today, and also other realms like different technologies and different gear that you can get as a filmmaker. So I'm not going to rehash the entire documentary. If you want the history of Canon, you can go and see both of those. They did great jobs. I'm just going to share some of my thoughts about what they were and some of the things that I took away, because it's not easy to dismiss Canon, because as a filmmaker who's trying to get films made, these guys made a ton of them. They worked really, really quickly. They made some really memorable, successful films almost by accident. One of the quotes is, what they lacked in taste, they made up for in enthusiasm. I think when we look at filmmaking now with this infinite supply, we miss that back when Canon was working, mainly in the 70s and 80s, there were movie houses, like there were theaters all over the world that just didn't have enough content. They could only get films intermittently from America, from the big cinema, from the big studios, and they were craving anything to show. And in a lot of places in the world, people just wanted to go and get out of the heat. They just wanted to spend a hot afternoon or a cold afternoon somewhere that was not outside on the corner, and the 20 cents or whatever a theater ticket cost, a movie ticket cost, was worth it. And they would often see the same movies again and again and again. They were all hungry for new content. It didn't really matter what that content was, as long as it had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And when we look at, why would Canon make so many bad movies, almost on purpose? They produced films that could have been good, and they would totally mess them up. And we realized that they were in a commodity business. They just needed a 3-reel movie. They didn't care where it came from, what the plot was, who wrote it, who directed it. As long as they could cut a decent trailer or even a decent poster, they would make that film. There's also the fact that the film industry tends to be a bubble. And by that, I mean that the people that work in Hollywood today only really talk to and interface with other Hollywood people. So they don't usually have a clear idea of how the outside world works. And you end up having an echo chamber where opinions get magnified and blown all out of proportion, so that and Hollywood as an industry becomes very out of touch with what the wider audience wants or thinks. And so you get, a ton of movies that no one wants to see getting made all at once, or you get themes and political opinions inserted into every single film, Hollywood thinking that that's the default, whereas they're really living in this small little echo chamber that, isn't representative of the wider American audience, and especially not representative of the wider global audience. That's true now. That's doubly true of Canon. Canon was this weird little ecosystem where the two cousins that ran the company weren't really in touch with anyone outside of their own world, and so greenlit and spent big on movies that they thought would be huge and often missed the mark. So it's easy to look at Canon's catalog and think, oh my God, they were just selling a commodity. They were just making a movie as quickly as they could, for as cheaply as they could. And eventually people caught on and stopped buying their films and they went broke. It's actually more complicated than that, because they had a couple of really big hits. Breaking was one of them. Because they weren't so fixated on what the script was or how good it was or whether it measured up to some predetermined level of quality, they could get a movie out much, much quicker. So when breakdancing became a big thing, they were the first to get a breakdancing movie into theaters. They shot this thing in a couple of weeks for under $1 million and got it into the movie theaters while the wave of the breakdancing was still fresh, and beat the big studio film that is now totally forgotten because it came second, even though they were already making it when Canon started making Breakin', and it became the definitive movie of that genre. It became the first, it had the first mover advantage. So their lack of quality and their lack of bureaucracy, which we'll touch on again, was sometimes such an advantage that, they made Breakin' for less than $1 million and it went on to gross $50 million. So you have this, 50x big success that then bankrolled a lot of the other bets that they made. They're also very good at the mockbuster trade, which means that, if the studios are doing a Sherlock Holmes film, and they're going to put a lot of money into advertising Sherlock Holmes and getting people excited about Sherlock Holmes. By the time that, because they move so quickly, studios would announce the film, Canon would do a mockbuster, like they would do a similar movie because Sherlock Holmes is in the public domain. They could get a similar movie out on either into the theaters or onto VHS at the same time as the big studio movie is spending all their money for advertising, and kind of draft off that marketing spend to make their film popular as well. I think Canon succeeded for so long because the studio system at the time had become so unwieldy. They had been burnt by big flops like Cleopatra, and they were trying to guarantee that every film would be a hit, which is impossible. So movies would get stuck in development hell. Directors would be sent to do rewrites, and then script doctors, and then rewrites again, and then recasting. It would take years for a movie to go from the idea stage to actually get into production. And this frustrated a lot of talented directors, and the idea that they could, walk in with a script to the Canon offices, have one of the cousins draw up a contract on a napkin, have them sign it, and be scouting literally the next day, was something that attracted a lot of great talent to Canon. They were able to move faster. They were able to get rid of all of that waste, because when a film is in development, it's still accumulating expenses. All this money has been spent on the film that's not ending up on the screen. It's all in this kind of amorphous world of development. So Canon just did away with all that. Yes, it meant that the overall quality was lower, but it meant the speed was faster, and it preserved some of those, some of the energy that makes movies exciting to watch. Now, they were, totally unencumbered by ethics. There's a story in the Electric Boogaloo documentary where they made a movie with Bo Derek, who was a model actress at the time. She went for a meeting with them about the movie. And then when the film, well, later on, there was a poster that came out for the movie that they were making. And she realized that while she was at the meeting, someone had opened her bags, gone through it, found some like nude photos or like bikini photos that her husband had taken of her, photocopied them secretly, put them back, and then those were the ones that they were using to sell the movie. Unhinged in what they would do to make a movie successful, what they would do to make a movie happen. The rules didn't apply to them. Another quote that stayed with me from the documentaries is that they loved cinema, the Canon guys, but in the abstract. They just loved the idea of cinema. They never put enough time and effort into the movie to make it good. They were just constantly greenlighting things, commissioning scripts, launching movies without spending the kind of hard time that if you're a filmmaker, you know it takes 50% of the effort to get it to a rough cut stage, and then the other 50% of the effort to do the last little bit to get the movie to like gel together, to get the movie to really sing and become a real story. That last little bit is the hardest because you're exhausted at that point. These guys never bothered with it. They just plowed straight through. If it was long enough, they would release it and just go on to the next one. Like I said in the beginning, that there are a lot of major cinema chains in every city in the world, and they're the ones that have the deals with the studios for the studio content. But there are also a lot of second-run cinemas, theaters and movie houses in places that weren't great, in the suburbs, in the backwoods, in the slums. And these people needed content too. They couldn't afford what the studio wanted to charge them, and they needed content. Canon was happy to provide them with that content. The movies weren't as good. The stars might have been a little older. They might have been a Chuck Norris rather than a Clint Eastwood. But, these theaters had a business to run. They needed content. Canon was there for them to charge them, to make deals with them, get the movies at much lower rates. It's sort of like the difference between, the first run Amazon, iTunes, Apple movies and the ones you can watch for free on YouTube or watch with ads on TiVo or whatever it is. There's always been this kind of A, B, and C levels of films. What Canon was doing was recognizing that not everything needs to be an A-lister, that we can produce B and C and Z pictures, genre films, kung fu movies, zombie, action. Action and horror translate really well to different languages. People are watching these movies that don't speak English. They speak French and Russian and Spanish and Chinese. Sometimes the people dubbing them won't speak the language and will be making up as they go along, kind of improving the script. So you just need, tough guys doing tough things. You need fights, you need explosions, you need scares, you need gore, you need, all of these things. And often, again, it's not sophisticated reviewer audiences, which is what the studios were obsessed with. They wanted their Times review and their Washington Post review to be 5 stars. The directors all wanted to get awards, and that is a important but small part of the global film market. I remember when I was watching Canon movies when I was like 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I couldn't really follow the plot anyway and didn't care. I wanted to see some guy blow something up because it was exciting to watch. It was interesting. It kind of gave me a little vision into the world outside my world. Chuck Norris movies, Bruce Lee movies, they're not there for the plot. You're there to see something exotic and powerful, and you feel powerful by extension. So I think Hollywood, and to this day, can get fixated on making movies for their peers. making movies for people in their 30s and 40s that went to college, that want to see interesting ideas explored. And that is still a very, very small part of the movie-going audience, because successful professionals don't go to the movies that often. Honestly, people that go to the movies a lot are people with a lot of spare time. Kids, teenagers, they want to see films where things happen that they think are interesting. That's not always the same thing that people that are directing age think are interesting. So Canon, in the indie sense of producing and budgeting, they would really cut a lot of corners. They would take the money that they had sold from the poster. They would just get a star and a title and a genre. They would put them together. They would sell it at Cannes every year to as many distributors as they can get the money from. Then they would try and make the film for as little as possible. That meant going to countries where there wasn't unions, where there wasn't safety protocols, where things were cheap. This is like Philippines, South America, Eastern Europe. They would hire people who would otherwise be, cutting sugarcane that day, and they could get for just a couple of dollars. They would typically fly over the star, the director of photography, and the director, maybe a producer, and then fill out the crew and cast with local talent, which, if the stories are true, sometimes they wouldn't even pay. They would say, oh yeah, the check's in the mail, and they would just fly out at the end. Sometimes they would cut every corner when it came to safety and gear. They would use the cachet of being American filmmakers to get every favor they could, saying, oh yeah, we're just the first. If you treat us well, there'll be plenty of other productions. And then, basically once the film had wrapped, they would fly out under cover of darkness. So they were using a lot of really kind of shady techniques, but they also had a lot of daring, and they had they didn't know what they didn't know. So if the studio system was sitting there analyzing, doing budgets, trying to work out if this is feasible, if it's not, they would show up in this either a second city in America, or go somewhere else with a big bag of cash and start making things, start shooting things, see what they could do as cheaply, as quickly as possible. Often this failed terribly, and you get these weird, unwatchable movies. Cyborg is a Canon film with Jean-Claude Van Damme. The stunt coordinator on set did a really bad job, and the actor who played the villain in Cyborg ended up being blinded by one in one eye by Jean-Claude Van Damme. They didn't have the proper protocols. That movie went on to make a ton of money. It's probably still making money to this day. It was one of the first post-apocalyptic sci-fi kung fu movies, of which there have been many more made afterwards, including probably a bunch of sequels. The acting's terrible. The script is terrible. Jean-Claude Van Damme spends the entire movie doing flying spinning back kicks. They're almost so bad they're good, is what Canon really capitalized on. But there was something magical about that film, especially on VHS, where, male teenagers all over the world will watch it every weekend and spin kick their friends. Being this scrappy, low budget, willing to try anything, opened a lot of doors in the film industry for people that worked for Canon. They were able to take chances, sometimes literally with their other people's lives, but also take chances thematically, in genre, in content, in editing, all these different things that, and then Hollywood, seeing how well that worked, went on and capitalized on it. Another way that Canon really did well was being able to ignore the politics of the studio system. Studio system in the 70s was very, very anti-Vietnam. It was very leftist, but not everyone was. There were a lot of people that suffered from communism and wanted to see or had fought in Vietnam or had family that had fought in Vietnam and really felt wounded by that conflict and had nowhere to put their feelings. Chuck Norris was a karate instructor and karate semi-combat fighter who'd lost a brother in Vietnam. He wanted to make a movie where some guy goes back to Vietnam and shoots a bunch of Vietnamese dudes and sort of somehow wins the war, gets the POWs out. And this gave rise to a franchise called Missing in Action, where Chuck Norris would show up and kill commies. And Hollywood would never have made that film by the politics of the time. This is when, Warren Beatty is making Reds about, lionizing the Russian Revolution. And here we have Chuck Norris shooting up the Vietnamese prisoner of war camp. These movies did really, really well, even because there was a huge amount of people who wanted to see this on screen. Hollywood wasn't going to give it to them, and Canon was only too happy to. Exactly the same with Death Wish. This was a book and then a movie about someone whose family is attacked by urban crime, killed and assaulted by muggers, which was on the rise at this time in the 70s and 80s. Charles Bronson plays a guy whose family's injured and then, family's attacked. Then he gets a gun and goes out killing street criminals. And again, Hollywood would never have made this film, but Canon made a bunch of them. They paid Brosnan $1 million an episode and just kept churning them out. Just 5 or 6 of them. So they took advantage of something that there was a huge audience for, but that Hollywood wasn't catering towards. And I think that is a real lesson that the bubble of Hollywood, the bubble of media, can oftentimes leave behind a huge segment of the viewership that then independent filmmakers can cater towards. Back in the 70s and 80s, back in the 70s, Canon was buying, and Roger Corman as well, buying kung fu movies from Hong Kong and Singapore, dubbing them and bringing them to the US, where they did really well. And, the grindhouses. Unfortunately, once they did really well, the Hong Kong producers started asking more and more money for the American rights because they knew how much they were worth. When that happened, Canon decided just to go around, find local kung fu schools or karate schools, find film students, give them cameras and have them make their own kung fu movies in America. When they were successful, they then sent people overseas to make kung fu films, kind of capitalize on the whole martial arts craze that kind of petered out, which then turned into the ninja craze that Canon did a bunch of movies with, American Ninja. And it sort of transitioned into, and they were at a really good time because they had made a lot of these movies to make money in theaters. And this is at the same time as VHS came on and then cable came on. So they were able to get paid for these movies again and again. And so that kept them in business, kept them producing more of these films for another decade. So why did Canon, eventually go bankrupt and go out of business? There were a couple of reasons. They had made a lot of money in early hits with Missing in Action, and they tended to take the money from these hits and bet really big on more hits rather than kind of really refining their process and making the overall quality of their movies better. They were always betting on the 100-to-1 horse that had a very small chance of winning. And when they got lucky on a couple of those, they, rather than, bet a bigger bet on a safer horse, they bet more and more on the 100-to-1 horses. And so you get these, really wild gambles that they have of not just in films, but in business, of borrowing all this money and buying a cinema chain and buying Canal's catalog and taking on all this debt. And they needed to be bringing in millions of dollars each week to kind of service the debt and keep the company going. And eventually that ran out. Another thing that happened too was that Hollywood saw their success and they in turn innovated. Once Star Wars came along and Hollywood realized that rather than constantly trying to make art pictures, that the action adventure sci-fi movies were super bankable, they started moving in that direction as well. And so they sort of did better versions with bigger stars of the same type of movie that Canon was making, right? And also cable television took off in a really big way in the 80s. And while that in the short term was a boon for Canon's back catalog, eventually the studios and other distributors who were actually making decent films came into that space and kind of pushed Canon out. They couldn't compete with bigger budgets and the more steady hand. Also, the people that did well in Canon movies then got offered jobs at decent salaries because they traditionally underpaid everybody. Same with Roger Corman. Roger Corman told Francis Ford Coppola, or maybe it was James Cameron, that if you do a good job with me, you'll never have to work for me again because your movie will be successful and then you'll actually get paid by people that know what they're doing. So I'm kind of interested. I'm really fascinated by the Roger Cormans and the Canon Group who sort of stay at the bottom. They try break into the big leagues and they get burnt really badly. So they basically don't have the capacity to produce big movies. So they sort of stay at the bottom and then eventually they get pushed out by something else. So my big takeaway with the Canon Group is that there's always opportunity out there for making films. We don't know, it's so easy to look at them and say, oh, wow, they were making movies in a fresh way, super cheap in foreign territories with great amount of freedom, and the audience loved it. So that's what we should do now. Well, not necessarily. Maybe the opportunities now are on YouTube or they're on, social media. There's an opportunity, like when Canon was doing that work, it was really unsexy and was looked down upon by the rest of the industry. So the question is, what is being looked down on now by the film industry that there is huge profits in, there is huge opportunity in? What films are there a demand for, but Hollywood not making? A couple of years ago, I would have said that this was social media advertising, right? If you made a film, you could get it in front of millions of people very, very cheaply because not many other films were using, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, Twitter to advertise their movie. Now the studios have moved into there. Those ads have become more expensive and it's harder to make a profit there. So the current opportunity, it might be producing with AI. It might be running ads on X because no one else is. There's always a big opportunity for every generation, but every generation is looking back on the previous generations and wishing they'd been there at that time, knowing what they know now. So my big takeaway from Canon is that there's always a way to make a movie that you want to make. There is always a way to tell a story that you want to tell. If you're willing to take chances, if you're willing to swim against the current and go against the grain to find what no one else is doing, the story no one else is telling, the way no one else is telling it. If you have the courage to believe in your idea and move forward. And I think as terrible filmmakers as they were, the Canon cousins really are an inspiration in being able to step back and see things from a different angle. A couple of years ago, this probably would have been you're making a whole feature film on an iPhone, right? That was a really interesting and brave thing to do. Not a particularly technically wise thing to do, but it got a lot of attention, like is it Tangerine or that first film shot. Now, Danny Boyle shot 28 years later on iPhone 15. Right now, it's become something the studios are doing for whatever reason. So what is the next version of that? That's what I want, the question I want to leave you with. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you next time.